The cold didn't simply sting, it ruled the air. A dense, unseen force that settled on Sarah's lungs as she stood on the icy mud of the main street. Behind her, the thick oak doors of the general store shut with a sharp click, a sound that rang louder than any rifle crack in her years. Her father-in-law, Thomas, hadn't bothered to meet her gaze when he delivered his final judgment. The land belongs to the bloodline. Sarah, you're a decent woman, but you're not blood. And with my son in the ground, there's no room here for a widow who brings nothing to the table. He hadn't raised his voice. He had spoken plainly, as if reciting a rule etched into the frontier itself, unyielding and cold as the iron stove he kept polished behind his counter. Sarah tightened her grip on the single burlap sack that held the remains of her life. 2 plain dresses, a small sewing kit, a thick wool shawl, and a cast-iron skillet worn smooth with use. No house, no husband, no child to anchor her name to this place. The town no longer felt like a community. It was a row of dark shapes beneath a bruised purple sky, every window she passed seeming to dim at her approach, as though the buildings themselves wished not to witness her exile. She walked toward the edge of town, where the structures thinned and the shadows stretched long across the frost-stiff ground. Her boots scraped and crunched over the frozen earth with every step. She paused outside the sheriff's office, not seeking shelter, not seeking comfort, but because of the brittle, yellowed paper nailed crookedly to the rough-hewn post beside the door. The notice had curled at the edges and was blotched by old rain. A tax deed. It described a narrow piece of land 3 miles up along the northern creek. A cabin stood on it, declared unfit for habitation. The listed price was $5, a token sum meant to wipe the ledger clean of property no one cared to claim. Sarah slipped her hand into the hidden pocket of her petticoat and felt the ridged edges of her last 5 silver coins, the same coins she had earned from selling her wedding quilt in secret, money she had once imagined would purchase a hopeful beginning somewhere warm and distant. "Is it still available?" she asked quietly as Sheriff Miller stepped out onto the porch. His face carried the tired look of a man accustomed to burying other people's tragedies. He glanced at the paper, then at her slight figure, at the way her fingers whitened around the sack. "That place is nothing but wreckage, Sarah. Half the roof's gone, the chimney's fallen to pieces. Winter's near. You won't last a week out there." She lifted her chin and held his eyes. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "I have $5, Sheriff, and nowhere else left to stand." He released a long breath that drifted into the air as mist. "Give me the coins, I'll sign it over. But when the frost deepens into a hard freeze, don't say I didn't warn you." He took the money and handed her the deed, his gaze lingering with a flicker of pity she refused to accept. "Good luck, Sarah. You're going to need it." The journey to the creek blurred into a haze of fatigue and creeping numbness in her toes. By the time she found the place, the moon hung overhead like a thin shard of ice. The cabin was no home. It was a carcass. Wide cracks gaped between the logs, where the chinking had long since fallen away. As the sheriff had said, a section of the roof had collapsed inward, surrendering to some forgotten storm. Snow from an earlier fall lay drifted across the dirt floor. Sarah stepped inside. The air within felt even harsher than the open trail. She did not cry. There was nothing left inside her that could spare the strength for tears. Instead, she searched for a corner where the roof still held. She kicked aside splintered wood and debris with the toe of her boot. Wrapping herself tightly in her wool shawl, she pulled the burlap sack close and leaned against the rough, frozen logs. Sleep came in short, shuddering bursts, thin, restless, and broken. At dawn, in the pale gray light, a shape darkened the doorway. Sarah jolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. An elderly woman stood there, wrapped in a coat stitched from mismatched furs, a chipped ceramic jug cradled in her hands. Her face was etched with deep creases, and her eyes were sharp and watchful like a hawk's. "I saw fire from my camp down the ridge," the elderly woman said, her voice brittle like dry leaves. "But there ain't no fire here. Name's Martha. I stay in the hollow." Sarah rose, brushing dirt from her skirt, gathering what remained of her pride amid the wreckage. "I purchased this land," she said. "I'm Sarah." Martha's gaze drifted around the cabin, pausing on the broken walls, the sagging beams. "You bought yourself a grave, girl," she muttered. "But since you're still breathing, you may as well drink." She extended the jug. Inside was warm cider, spiced with something strong and earthy. The first swallow spread through her chest like a struck match. "I have work to do," Sarah said, after a long drink, handing it back. Martha studied her, slow and silent. "Work's the only thing that keeps the ghost of the cold at bay," she replied. "There's old clay down by the creek bed, frozen on top but wet underneath if you dig deep enough. Pack it in those cracks before sundown." She turned as if to leave, then paused. Reaching into her coat pocket, she drew out a small rusted trowel and held it out toward Sarah. "Keep it. It's better than using your fingernails." She walked away without another word, disappearing into the morning mist. Sarah looked at the tool in her hand, the first piece of kindness she had felt since the funeral. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty air, the words feeling heavy and strange in her mouth. The work began with a desperation that left her hands raw and bleeding. Sarah spent the next 3 days hauling buckets of heavy gray clay from the creek, her muscles screaming with every movement. She mixed the clay with dried grass she gathered from the clearing, creating a thick, sticky mortar. She pushed the mixture into the gaps between the logs, her fingers numbing as the moisture seeped into her skin. The wind whistled through the remaining holes, mocking her progress, but she didn't stop. Every inch she sealed was a victory over the elements. On the 4th day, as she was struggling to lift a fallen beam that had been part of the roof, a man approached the clearing. He was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a heavy leather roll of tools. He was the town's blacksmith, a man named Henry, who rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time. He stood and watched her for a moment, his eyes taking in the repaired sections of the wall. "Sheriff said a woman was up here trying to live in a ghost house," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I'm not a ghost, and I'm not leaving." Henry walked over to the beam, gripped it with one hand and heaved it back into its original position, as if it weighed nothing. He opened his tool roll, revealing saws, chisels, and a heavy hammer. "The chimney is the priority. You can't have a fire if the smoke has nowhere to go but your lungs." He didn't ask for permission. He simply began to work, clearing the rubble of the old hearth. Sarah watched him for a moment, then picked up her trowel and began to assist, handing him stones and mixing more mortar. They worked in a rhythmic silence for hours. By the time the sun began to dip, a sturdy, though modest hearth had been rebuilt. Henry stood back, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "You have a strong back, Sarah. Most would have stayed in town and begged for a room in the boarding house." Sarah looked at the new hearth, the heart of her home finally taking shape. "Begging doesn't keep you warm, Henry. Only fire does." He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'll leave a hammer and a box of nails. You need to fix that roof before the big clouds come. They're heavy with snow, and they're moving fast from the north." He turned to go, but paused. "If you finish the roof, come to the forge. I have some scrap iron you can use for a door latch." Sarah felt a surge of pride that was unfamiliar and sharp. "I'll be there," she promised. The roof was a nightmare of heights and rotting timber. Sarah used the nails Henry had left to secure the salvaged boards, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she balanced on the edge of the loft. She used her sewing skills in a way she never imagined, stitching together old canvas sacks she found in the corner and layering them over the weakest spots, then weighing them down with heavy stones. Every time the wind gusted, the entire structure groaned, and her heart would leap into her throat. But she stayed. She learned the language of the cabin, the way the logs settled, the specific whistle of the wind through the chimney, the smell of damp earth turning to dry dust. One evening, as she sat by her first small fire, watching the smoke rise perfectly through the flue, a soft knock came at the door she had fashioned from scrap planks. It was a young girl from town, maybe 12 years old, named Molly. She held a heavy iron pot wrapped in a towel. "My mother sent this," Molly said, her eyes wide as she looked at the transformed interior. "She said you were the widow who bought the $5 house. She said you must be starving." Sarah took the pot. The scent of beef stew and root vegetables was almost overwhelming. "Tell your mother I am grateful," Sarah said softly. Molly lingered, looking at the neatly patched walls. "It's actually pretty in here now. It smells like pine and smoke." Sarah looked around. The dirt floor had been swept clean, the gaps were sealed, and her few belongings were arranged neatly